And thank you everybody for being here. It's nice to see the applause coming in. I can virtually hear it. I really appreciate it. So welcome to the afternoon session on Open COVID Pledge for Education. My name is Elizabeth Charles and I'm an ALT trustee. My day job, I'm Assistant Director of Library Services at Birkbeck, University of London. We've got a wonderful panel for you this afternoon. And what we intend to do is each panel member will speak for 5 minutes, then we'll throw the floor open for discussions and questions, etc. So with no further ado, it's Helen. Helen Beetham is going to be our first speaker. She's a researcher and consultant in digital literacies and digital learning. And I believe at the moment that her camera is not working, so we will just hear her presentation, her 5 minutes presentation. So Helen, if you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm not sure it's my camera, but we can't seem to get it to play with Blackboard Collaborate today.
Fair enough. You're coming in very clearly, so
thank you.
That's
a great relief. That's great to hear. So thank you, and thanks to everyone for coming to talk about the Open COVID Pledge, which is it's really exciting to see so many people who want to talk about it. While I kind of say a little bit about the background to the pledge, I will put a few links into the chat window so that anyone who hasn't had a chance to catch up on what the pledge is and how ALT has supported it can go and have a look and maybe, if you're not multitasking, catch up afterwards. So what is the Open COVID Pledge for Education? Well, the original kind of inspiration for me to think about this very much came from the Open COVID Pledge, which is something that quite recently the Creative Commons have taken over looking after, but have always been involved in. And the Open COVID Pledge is a pledge to release IP relating to, it could be medicine, healthcare, it might be logistics, it might be public health, obviously in the interest of the global collaboration to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the really exciting thing that we can all see happening in the world right now is that openness is being revealed to be not just a good way to do things, an ethical way to do things, and a collaborative way to do things, but actually the most effective way to do things when we're facing an urgent global challenge that has to be addressed using the best resources that humanity can offer. But of course, all that is also true of the educational response. And quite early on, I talked to Creative Commons about whether the Open COVID Pledge really could include educational responses. And their feeling was it wasn't really about the kind of things we had to share in education, and maybe something special, aligned, but separate might be called for. It seemed to me a really great opportunity to blow the trumpet of education, that the challenges facing the world today are also educational ones. And there was a great UNESCO report, which I think is quoted in our blog post for this session, called Education in a Post-COVID World. And there's a lovely quote in there about the fact that we're all in this together. We're safe when everybody is safe, and we flourish when everybody flourishes. And so as with open science, it felt like it was a moment for open education to kind of assert the contribution it could make at this particularly challenging time. There's an awful lot going on already, of course, in open science and in open education. It's not that the COVID pandemic created lots of initiatives. We all know and are affiliated probably with many of the things that are going on. So for example, last year we had the UNESCO recommendations on OER. I would encourage you to all go and look at the many open educational foundations and organisations that signed the pledge, and the great work that they were doing before COVID came along, but of course that they have stepped up to the plate as COVID has bitten, and as around the world we've had this kind of emergency, if not an emergency open pivot yet, it's certainly been an emergency online teaching pivot, and we're all trying to understand what that means. So why have an Open COVID Pledge specifically for education? Clearly there was a precedent for a worldwide kind of badging of what it is that open can do. I think there was perhaps two different motivations, and one of them definitely was to promote the value and relevance of open at this time of urgent response. As I've said, as every college and university is having to pivot towards this huge challenge of supporting students when they're not face to face with you, we already knew there were resources to help do that. We knew not just day-to-day online teaching, but actually emergency response online teaching has happened in other parts of the world before, and we knew those were there to be shared. And it was about creating something to orientate around. But I guess for people who haven't already made the step into open, universities and colleges, departments, research funders perhaps, it was a way of creating a bit more impetus for that. Now is the time. If you were ever thinking of making a step towards open, of sharing more openly what you do, now is the time to do it. And I think the final part for me was this sense we all have that the pandemic is a bit of a crossroads. Which way are we going to go in the building back after or during the pandemic? Openness, trust, the public commons of learning, of course, is the way that ALT has stuck its flag in, and we're all very, very grateful to the leadership that ALT has offered in that. But it's not a done deal, and I think it was a way of marking that crossroads and the decisions that had to be made around it. So let's be practical. If we have a pledge to share and we're asking people to take that pledge, what is it we think that's worth sharing from and for education at this time? I think perhaps the most obvious and concrete one is open educational resources for open educators about open education. So there's been this amazing outpouring of generosity from members of the community and beyond. Not me, so thank you, whoever that was. You know, videos, open resources, best practice guides, infographics. We all know we've been contributing into that space. And one thought was there might be a room for some better coordination of that, maybe some pathways or workflows for people arriving new to find some of those resources. There have been lots of efforts to pull it together already, and many of the open foundations that have pledged have done some of that. But you know, maybe there was a way we could work, perhaps with Wikimedia, who we're speaking to, and this is a place for you to bring your ideas about that sharing process and whether more could be done. I think the second category for me is around policy, the policy response. What decisions are being taken right now that maybe look like logistical and technical, but are becoming organisational, pedagogical, and even political decisions, and how we share that policy making, and as we discussed in the opening plenary this morning, how we share the ethical and political dimensions of that. And I guess the last piece that could be shared would be some of the research that's taking place in organisations at every level about the impact of this, about how to do this well, about how to engage students. Some of the grant-making bodies have created a lot of incentives and opportunities for researchers to shift their research towards this area, but also there's lots and lots of practice-based research that we maybe are involved in that we could be sharing. So there's a kind of gallop through what the pledge could be about. I have to say it's very open-ended what happens with the pledge next. There are about 200 people and organisations signed up, and I do hope to encourage many of you to do that. But there's also different ways that the pledge could go next, and in order to help us think about that, it's delightful that there are some of my co-panelists wanting to talk about what their organisations do in this space and whether the pledge has been supportive of that. I know that there are people who are doing amazing work in open education already, but I will leave them to say a little bit about what they think the pledge means, and then maybe we can come back to talking about how best to take it forward from here. So I'm happy to be quiet and pass the mic on.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was wonderful setting of the context on where we are now. Our next speaker is going to be Lorna Campbell. She's the Learning Technology Service Manager at the University of Edinburgh.
Okay, just let me get my video on. Can I just check that you can all hear me clearly?
Coming in loud and clear. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Elizabeth. And it's a real pleasure to be here as part of this panel today. And I have to say, I've really been enjoying the conference so far. I thought the opening plenary and some of the early sessions were really stimulating and surfaced some really important themes that I'm sure we'll be talking about more throughout the conference. And I think openness has always been a really strong theme across all the ALT conferences, and of course it is a strategic commitment to ALT. And I think Helen has really outlined very articulately just why openness is even more important than ever at this time of crisis. And as Elizabeth said, I work as a learning technology service manager at the University of Edinburgh, and the service that I manage there is the university's Open Education Resources Service. I should also add that I'm a trustee of the Association for Learning Technology and Wikimedia UK, two organisations that also have a very strong commitment to openness. So I know I've spoken to quite a lot of you before about why openness is so important to the University of Edinburgh, because we really see it as a really powerful way to achieve our institutional mission, which is to share our knowledge and make the world a better place. And what better way to do that than to have a strategic commitment to openness? And the university has had an open education resources policy and service for the last 5 years. And like I said, you've probably heard many of us talking about the service and the policy at various alt conferences over the years. But what I want to focus on today is how that strategic commitment enabled the university not just to respond to the COVID pandemic, but also to be able to make a contribution and a commitment to the Open Pledge. And the reason we were able to do that was we were already sharing, we're in the habit of sharing so much of our practice and our resources freely available under open license online. I just want to highlight a few quite practical examples of ways we've done that. So we've already had quite a lot of discussion around the need for new policy to deal with the new forms of education that we very rapidly pivoted to. So, for example, I think some of you will probably have heard my colleague Vicky Madden from the University of Edinburgh's Digital Skills Service earlier on this morning talking about new guidance that the university developed around digital safety and citizenship, which of course are absolutely critical as we're moving more and more of our learning and teaching experience and indeed our daily lives online. And of course, we immediately made the resources collated by Vicky and our colleagues available under open license because we know that they will be of huge value to other institutions. At the same time, we developed a policy for virtual classroom recording. And again, my colleague Neil McCormick, who was instrumental in developing that policy, will be talking tomorrow about how we develop that policy from an existing lecture recording policy. And we always make our policies freely available under open license. So you can actually go onto the university's OER website and you can find our virtual classroom policy, our lecture recording policy, our OER policy, our digital citizenship and safety guidelines that are designed to support them. They're all available under open license. So that was one very sort of concrete way that we were able to share our practice with the wider community. And the approach that we take to openness and to OER at the university is very much, we kind of view it almost as infrastructure. So we don't have a single dedicated OER repository. Instead, we kind of view the web as a platform that we use to share our open practice and our open content. So we have lots and lots of blogs, which I'll come back to a little bit about in a minute. We make extensive use of social media. And again, Vicky already spoke about this morning in terms of disseminating our digital safety and citizenship resources. We're very active on social media, and we really see this as part of our mission to share our knowledge. So of course, because we already had all these channels, it was very easy for us to actually start sharing content through the Open COVID Pledge simply by using the hashtag. And it sounds almost like a trivial thing to do, but it is actually incredibly powerful. And I think what's so important is by just having this commitment, by having the pledge, and by having something as simple as a hashtag, it really lowers the barriers of participation and enables people to get involved as well. Now, I also mentioned blogging, and we also have a centrally supported academic blogging service at the University of Edinburgh. And one of the things we've seen over the last 8 to 10 months or so is an incredible explosion of blogging of all kinds. I think we now have well over 3,000 academic and professional and student blogs hosted on the university's platform. And many of those blogs are sharing experiences, are sharing practice, are sharing innovation, are sharing student experience of, even working on placements. And a lot of these blogs are being shared under open license. So if you want to find out how the university has responded to the pandemic and what experiences we're sharing, then I can highly recommend, again, just having a look at these open blogs. But we also feel it's important, again, as Helen was saying, it's part of what the pledge is about. It's about sharing open education resources for educators. And again, we've seen a real explosion of interest in using blogs as part of assessed coursework to support hybrid and remote learning. And although we have a lot of colleagues that are very enthusiastic about using blogging to support hybrid learning, there can be quite a steep learning curve, particularly if you want to start assessing these blogs. So one of the resources that we've shared is an output of one of our PTAS projects. PTAS projects are Principals Teaching Award projects. Sorry, I haven't got that acronym quite right. But these awards allow our academic staff to take a step back and to do proper academic research on their own practice. And a couple of years ago, we had a colleague who did a project about assessed blogging, and they have now shared assessment criteria for blogs as one of the outputs of that project. And again, we were able to share that through the OER service and to make that available to other colleagues around the UK who may be interested in looking at that. So there are lots of small incremental ways that we've been able to share our experience. Another blog that I would really like to highlight is my senior colleague Melissa Highton, who has very much been one of the drivers of the university's vision for open education and open knowledge. And one of the, I think, really important blog posts that Melissa has shared earlier this year is a summary of an equality and diversity survey that was undertaken by the university. And although we're not in a position to make all the data freely available for obvious reasons, I think being able to share high-level summaries like that is really, really important. And again, just being able to put that information on a professional blog and share that on a hashtag is a very simple and powerful way to actually make a real difference and to make a contribution to the pledge. And perhaps one of the last examples that I want to highlight is the COVID critical care Mooc. Now, this was a Mooc that was developed by our critical care MSc team right at the beginning of the pandemic, and they had a lot of resources that they knew would be of immense value to healthcare professionals who were having to rapidly upskill to begin to work on critical care wards. So they immediately made those resources available online through a partnership with FutureLearn. And the whole process of developing this incredible Mooc took, I think it was 4 weeks end to end. The Mooc production took about 2 weeks. And that resource has been used by tens of thousands of educators since it was first launched. But what's important about that story is the reason that that was able to happen was that the critical care team were already familiar with the idea of sharing under open license, of sharing their resources, of making sure their content was copyright cleared. And because we have this sort of infrastructural approach to openness, we were very easily able to shift that content around different platforms to ensure that it was readily available where people could access it, whether that was on our own institutional systems or whether it was like shifting it onto a platform like FutureLearn, which could accommodate large numbers of people. And again, we've written a lot about the experience of creating this resource, and I think there's a lot of there's a lot of important lessons to be learned there. You know, whether you're, you know, actually in the medical education domain or not is less important. But I think what is important is it was that commitment to openness that enabled us to come together, to really move mountains, to share that content when it was needed. And again, I know Helen has spoken about the timeliness of this initiative, and I think this is one thing that openness does enable you to do. It enables you to respond quickly to the demands of crisis like we faced earlier on this year. So I'm going to stop there. There are lots of other examples I could provide, but I know that Catherine, has a lot of insight that she can bring to the topic as well.
Thank you, Lorna. That was really good. Carrying on the theme, we're really getting there. Now I'd like to introduce Catherine Cronin, who's the Strategic Education Developer at Ireland's National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. Catherine, when you're ready, please feel free to start.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, I can hear you. Please continue.
That's great. Thanks so much. I nearly forgot that I was supposed to speak because I was listening so closely to what you were saying, Lorna. But in listening, a few things struck me just in listening to you, Lorna and Helen, and that just this moment is so much a part of, you know, what this whole project is. And, you know, I know many of us are aware that, you know, in the immediate move to remote online teaching and learning, many people came to it new, and, you know, there were lots of tweets and remarks about, you know, oh, are we reinventing online learning now, because there's a long history of this, and this is a good thing because we're able to revisit it and draw from, you know, just as I said, a long history of practice, of scholarship, and so on. And the same can be said for open education. There's a long history of open education as well. There are many newcomers to open education, particularly this year. But I think what we're doing in the pledge and in other work that, you know, Lorna was just talking about is drawing from this, you know, body of practice that many people who are new, perhaps to open, can learn from and can benefit from. So, you know, and in explaining just the wider context, I suppose, you know, as a lot of us have acknowledged, whatever any of us knew about inequality in education or in society before this year, each of us certainly knows a lot more now. So, you know, a lot of these barriers have already been discussed today, but I think the kinds of things that Lorna and Helen were talking about show that, you know, a lot of the open resources in terms of policy and practice, and even in terms of reflections on practice, are immensely valuable now, and we're just trying to make the most of that. So I was able to have some conversations with Helen over the course of the summer as the pledge was coming together, which was very exciting. Now it has over 200 signatories, and we hope that there will be more, because it's through those kind of productive conversations and collisions and collaborations, you know, among those who support the pledge, that I think we can really move forward. So I was asked to talk a little bit just also about how, you know, how my organization, the National Forum, in Ireland, has embraced openness, and, you know, we are a signatory to the pledge already. And for those of you who don't know, the National Forum is a small, neutral, academically led body in Ireland, publicly funded, that supports all who teach and all who learn in the Irish higher education sector. My particular area that I work in the forum is in digital and open education. But the only way that we're able to do the work that we do in the forum, as I said, we're very small, is through collaboration with students, with staff, with institutions, and with a host of other bodies, but also projects and initiatives that go on across the sector. So we foster collaboration across those. That's probably the most important thing that we do. So we have a document that we've written. It's called an insight into how and why we support open education. So it declares that the National Forum supports open education principles, practices, and policies, and gives some information about how we do that. I can share the URL just after I'm finished speaking here. Just there's one page that has all of the National Forum kind of resources and statements about open education. But just as in the FAIR principles for research, you know, the A in FAIR is about, you know, open access, says that data should be as open as possible, but as restrictive as necessary. We just are always thinking about mapping that to teaching and learning, and using a critical approach to openness means that we try to maximize and facilitate sharing and reuse and adaptation and remix, but we also recognize that openness is personal and contextual. So it's navigating that tension all the time, to help as many people as possible. So in terms of concrete examples of exactly how we do this, all of the National Forum's resources, reports, guides, our suite of open courses, webinars, data from our recently completed index survey, our digital experience survey, all of that is available openly. But to link back to what Lorna just said, currently we are revising an existing guide that was authored by the National Forum about 2 years ago called A Guide to Developing Enabling Policies for Digital Teaching and Learning. The new version of that guide will be called The Guide to Enabling Policies for Digital and Open Teaching and Learning. There's a small team of people working on this at the moment. And because, for example, Edinburgh shares not only their policies, as Lorna described, but also the narrative, how they got the teams together, to create, for example, the learning analytics policy or a statement of principles. That kind of open sharing really facilitates other people like ourselves as we go forward to create resources for the Irish higher education sector. Likewise for the digital safety and citizenship resources. So I could say a lot more, but I just wanted to say that's kind of a brief snapshot of how the National Forum sees itself as supporting open practice and some of the ways that we do that, but also how others' open practice enables us to do that better. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Catherine. Right, so this is the pot now where we throw the floor open for further discussion. There was one question which was came up in the chat, which was about quality. I think it was Jim Turner who sort of said wanted to hear a bit more about Wikimedia as open educational resources. There's always the issues about the difficulty of quality. Anybody want to kick that ball around?
I'd be happy to take that one.
Thank you.
I think it's the whole question of quality and open education is one that has come up since time immemorial. And I do sometimes think it's a bit of a red herring. I think sometimes quality can be quite often used as an excuse not to engage with open education. And I think people are very, very quick to talk about quality when it comes to open education resources in a way that they are less quick to do when they're maybe talking about textbooks published by big publishers who, as we heard earlier on this morning, have some quite questionable ethical working practices. So I think our benchmarks for quality can be quite subjective. However, I think when it comes to quality and open education resources, clearly what is important is context. It's a context of use. It's not frequently the quality of an educational resource is not inherent in the resource itself. It's whether you're using it in an appropriate context. There are also issues around the reliability of information, which is, I think, slightly different from the quality of an open education resource. And it's interesting that you should mention Wikipedia, because one thing I didn't mention in my little sort of talk was as part of the University of Edinburgh's commitment to open knowledge, we have a Wikimedian in residence, Ewan McAndrew. And we very much see the Wikimedia projects as learning technologies and as a really powerful way for our staff and students to develop really critical information, digital literacy and copyright skills. Because one of the really powerful things about Wikipedia and all the Wikimedia projects is that they are absolutely transparent in terms of how the data is constructed. It is much easier to see where information on Wikipedia came from than it is in many other places, and even that includes scholarly journals sometimes, where you really have to go digging for the data. And what we found is that by engaging with the creation of Wikipedia articles, it's a brilliant way to really build the kind of critical information literacy skills that are so important at this point in time. And when it comes to quality, I know that there's a lot of talk about the unreliability of content on the encyclopedia, but I think you'll find that if you create an article that is poorly cited or biased in any way, it will actually get flagged and taken down really quite rapidly. So for our students who are creating Wikipedia articles as part of their assignments, learning how to create and interpret information accurately and produce really high quality information that is well cited, so that it will stick on the encyclopedia, is a really important lesson.
Thank you very much, Lorna. Helen, you've got your hand up. Did you want to? Oh yes, sorry. Before you do, Helen, Jim, can we allow Jim to speak?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more actually with your answer to that, but I find it really difficult to phrase questions properly. I was actually really excited about what Helen was talking about the connection, because actually the question was more focused around how to organize these materials. So I find a real difficulty is finding them and perhaps sorting them into some kind of quality, so that it's easier for the secondary school teacher to look through a resource and be able to find something. Because the problem is you can end up spending more time looking for something and judging its quality than it could be to actually produce something yourself. So there's something missing about the way that we organize this material going forward. And it seems such a shame actually that over the years we've been very efficient at creating stuff, but we still lack that way of being able to, I don't know whether it's tag it or whatever technology we use to kind of organize it in a useful structure.
Can Lorna, you want to come in quickly?
If I can just quickly come back to that. I mean, I kind of agree with what you're saying. And again, this is one of the reasons why in Edinburgh we haven't got a single open education resources policy. Instead, we've decided to put the resources in a place where people who want to use them will find them. So when we create resources for school teachers, we put them on TED's resources because we know that's where school teachers go to find resources. And we tag them with Scottish Curriculum for Excellence learning levels and outcomes, because we know that's the information that teachers use to find the content. So we absolutely believe that it's important to don't lock your stuff up in a repository. Put that content somewhere where the people who will find it most useful will be able to access it.
Thank you, Lorna. Helen, did you want to come back?
Thank you. Well, so much come back, but maybe move on a little. So thanks,
Please.
Jim, for that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I think, you know, we all know we don't want another repository, and it may be that even the kinds of projects that are most valuable to do might not necessarily be curational projects, although they might be. One of the things we've been chatting about, those of us who've been involved in developing the pledge, is sort of thinking about the workflows and what the workflows are that lead educators to actually want to share or to look for open resources. So some of the projects we might run might not look like curation projects, but I do also want to open the conversation out from OERs for educators, because in a way the problem there is one of abundance rather than, particularly at this point in time, rather than a lack of abundance. I think where there is a lack of abundance are the other two categories that I mentioned, and one was sharing policy initiatives and some of the sort of guidance type materials that might be coming out of this moment. And I just want to draw attention back to the links to the earlier keynote panel around ethical frameworks, because there is no doubt that openness is an ethical commitment. Universities and colleges are entering into all kinds of contractual commitments, which they see as logistical and technical solutions at the moment, but which may actually be have pedagogical, ethical, privacy, and even legal implications. And we're all aware of very high profile cases where learning technology experts have pushed back against some of these developments. Now, how do we share some of the ways that we can how can we actually manifest and share, including with the ethical framework of ALT, which I think is a really powerful intervention. But there are other more local examples of policy being made, of checklists, of guidance being produced at all kinds of levels in the organisation, which would be wonderful to share beyond the organisation, because it's a shared problem, it's a shared kind of context. And the other bit that I raised was research, and by research we don't necessarily mean formally published research, Although I think it's really worth noting that many journals have created large areas of COVID relevant content, which is outside of their usual paywalls and access arrangements, and there's no reason why education journals could not do the same. But I also think that a large part of the research that's relevant is what Catherine talked about. It's often it looks more like reflections on practice, or it's very practice focused research. It might be responses from student voice panels and from staff, which again, you know, have become very privatized and very localized because institutions see it as a problem and they don't necessarily want to go public with it. So I just want to not put aside the conversation about OERs, which is, I know for this community is a really important one, but to suggest there are other things that might be shared in this moment that might move you think of other ways of sharing that might be relevant.
Thank you, Helen. Catherine, did you want to come back?
Sure, thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, I just might connect the dots on two of the things that arose in the conversation there. One is around quality and one is around sharing policies that Helen just mentioned. And that is that, you know, we intentionally don't use the term best practice because, you know, even in a very small country like Ireland, the diversity of institutions within the country is enormous, not to mention the diversity of staff and students, you know, within them. So, you know, we just talk about sharing practice, and, you know, I won't even speak about OER, but you know, who defines quality in terms of OER? You know, if one elite institution in the US produces a great textbook, is that quality, you know, for everyone around the world? Certainly not. So we need to consider context, and we need to consider the agency of the people who are engaged in the likes of policymaking, for example. So in the year before COVID hit us, we facilitated a series of regional workshops in Ireland, where people shared their stories of digital and open policy making to support teaching and learning. So learning analytics policies, blended learning policies, and the like. And you know, one of the stories from the field or learning from failure was someone who, you know, who put together a great policy in a small room with just a few people, got their open access policy approved, bingo, got it signed off at senior management and so on, delighted, and then found that no one knew what the policy was, no one felt part of it, you know, and he had to start from the ground up then. And so, you know, he shared that story for all of us just as a way of saying, you know, it isn't just about having great examples, but that kind of point the way, and then we have to engage in, you know, democratic decision making, you know, within our respective contexts. So, you know, the example that Lorna shared of, you know, that sharing not just their policies but their policy making approaches are useful, but we don't just pick them up and run with them, you know, in any context. But it's a great starting point. So it's, you know, it's vital that we share, but that's really just the start of the process.
Thank you, Catherine. Lorna, did you want to come back?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up very briefly on something Catherine said there about learning from failure, because, and again, when I was speaking earlier on about, you know, the approach that we take to supporting and to embedding open education resources at Edinburgh, it's very much, we focus on digital skills development so that all our staff and our students will hopefully, you know, develop this awareness of the benefits of sharing resources under open license and of reusing existing resources as well. And it does mean that our academic colleagues and our student body produce all kinds of amazing content. And one resource that was shared amongst our open media resources recently was a short lecture for students about learning from failure, which was produced by one of our lecturers in the business school as part of a series of resources about to help students to study at university now in this hybrid environment. And she has 2 lectures available there, Dr. Sarah Ivory, and another one of them is about how to focus on Zoom lectures or on virtual lectures or virtual classroom sessions. And again, these are sort of serendipitous resources that have arisen from our academic body and just put out there under open license, which we're able to pick up and share. And again, we can tweet them with the Open COVID Thread hashtag, and I'll pop them in the chat in a minute.
Thank you for that. Helen, did you want to come in? I note that you mentioned about the possibility of perhaps we could do something following on from the conference on lightning talks for the different threads, which I think is a really interesting idea and might allow us to focus on each one in turn. But please have your say.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, Creative Commons are big on lightning talks, and Marie Cruz also and I shared some lightning talks from the EU around their educational response. So yeah, just to share both Elizabeth's call really to use this session for the little time we have left to make suggestions, because really the Open COVID Pledge is an incredibly lightweight thing, really frighteningly so. So it's just the pledge and the wording of the pledge, and there's now, I don't want to call it a badge because that will be confusing, but there's a little logo you can download, there's a discussion list, and there's the hashtag. And there are some people who've been championing this, of whom Catherine and Lorna are kind of really at the forefront, and Alt and Martin and Maren. But really that's how lightweight it is. So if it needs to be filled out with people's ideas and ambitions and requests and wish lists, which we would love to hear more of. But one of the things I just want to share that sort of slightly surprised me, what I thought this might be about was a number of organisations that are just stepping into Open, finding the pledge, they're sort of champions within those organisations, which might be a department or an institute or a whole college or university, using the pledge as a way to just to do some of that internal work of securing some kind of public commitment, which then allows the real nitty-gritty internal work to happen. And various people who've tried to do that have said, which we knew, how incredibly difficult that is. So I think it would be really what Catherine, I think, was talking about as kind of stories of failure and stories of success. Kind of the stories about how we got here from there are really, really valuable, and sometimes more valuable even than the end result, the great piece of guidance, the great policy statement, whatever it is. So I think if we could find ways of sharing those stories, that would be great. But the piece that I didn't expect to happen, and I guess you could say the great success, is a number of really globally powerful and active organisations in open education who did want to sign, and who several of them have said in a variety of meetings, we don't collaborate enough. You know, this is a moment in which all the organisations working in open education in a variety of ways might find better ways to collaborate. Now, something as lightweight as the pledge can't achieve that, but it was interesting to me to surface that desire for greater collaboration, if you like, the sort of top down, people who we already turn to for the guidance, for the networking, for the community, for the practice, you know, saying, well, actually, we could be doing open more openly, or we could be doing open more collaboratively. So I would be really interested to hear what people think about both the kind of bottom-up nitty-gritty aspect of how we can share stories about moving our organisations in this direction, more how we can share those stories and make them more powerful, but also that question about how we can, those of us who are involved in open, who include many people in this virtual room, do we need more collaboration? Is this a moment when that collaboration might come to the fore a little bit more?
Thank you, Helen. Does anybody, show of hands, if anybody wants to take the mic? Just having a quick look to see if anybody's put their hands up. Maren, please go ahead.
Hi, Elizabeth. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
I guess I wonder, as Helen mentioned and others, organisations like ALT have been supporting the pledge, and I wonder whether it could be useful to hear from the panel on sort of, you know, one thing every organisation could do in response or to try and progress the agenda.
Catherine?
Thanks. And I know Lorna has some ideas as well. It's a great question, Maren, and thinking of it also in terms of this notion of sharing stories. One of the things that's observable in a group of open educators is, or open education, even organizations or projects, is a group of people who are fairly comfortable with, you know, putting their hand up and saying, yeah, I'll share that, or I'll put that out there, or whatever. And the further we get from the days when we didn't engage in that practice, the further we are from probably appreciating just sometimes the fear or the anxiety or even the terror of, you know, putting something out there with your name on it and so on. So about sharing stories or about signing the pledge or whatever, I sense that, you know, if we put out an invitation like that, the first people we'll get are the people who are super comfortable in open spaces. So maybe something those of us who are in that comfortable space could do is agree to kind of partner with someone who's new, who's maybe come new to open just this year, someone who we've maybe helped, you know, along the way, even in a small way, to either, you know, if it's a story sharing exercise, or if it's getting more people to sign the pledge, or just kind of broadening that group, you know, so that it's so that people can develop that confidence and comfort with sharing and being open, and B, so that maybe we don't seem like such a, you know, an extant, existing, closed, for lack of a better word, you know, network of people who already know how to do this. So just a few thoughts.
Okay, Lorna, you were next, and then Helen.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with what Catherine said there. I think it is. I think it's really important for those of us who are familiar and comfortable in the open space and with sharing things, do what we can to help encourage others into that space, because I think it's very easy to forget just how challenging it can be, as Catherine said, you know, to actually put stuff out there with your name on it, or even just to think about putting stuff out there in the first place. And that can be quite a hurdle to get over. So I think the more we can do to bring people with us is really important. And again, that is very much one of our focuses within the OER service at Edinburgh. It's not about what we do, it's about what our colleagues can do, and it's about, you know, finding our colleagues who are, you know, naturally producing things in the open and sharing them, and actually sort of bringing them along and sort of saying, you know, these resources you're creating are really valuable and useful to other people, so please can we showcase them, please can we highlight them, please can we share them through our social media accounts. And of course that brings them along, and I think that's quite an important role that communities like the alt community can play. And I very much see alt as playing a central role in supporting open education practice in the UK. I think alt really stepped into a gap quite a long time ago now, probably about sort of almost 10 years ago, as JISC pulled out of this space. I think alt very much did step up, and I certainly see alt now as almost being like the you know, maintaining the legacy of open education in the UK, but also bringing new people into that space. I think that's really important. And I think that's something we can all do on a personal level, you know, as Catherine said, you know, whether it's with colleagues within our own institutions or with people that we engage with across the wider alt community.
Okay, Helen, you had your hand up. I think you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, I put in the chat window an entirely pre-prepared suggestion for what people might do. But of those three things, the last one is very much the most important one, because I think we really have to bring people into this conversation who can't do the first two, who can't sign the pledge on behalf of their organisation, who can't share their stuff, and we need to really hear about what the problems are. I love that we have so many opportunities and conferences to celebrate open education, but I also feel, and I'm sure many of you share this, that actually some of the changes that have happened over the last 9 months are going to make it harder to share. You know, universities have invested in platforms, and they've invested a huge amount of their intellectual content in those platforms. That, you know, the platforms they've bought into have become kind of content platform nexus for the university, and that they don't necessarily want to release the content from those platforms into the open, partly because some of the people making those decisions may not necessarily be the ones who've been engaged with thinking about digital education for as many years as some of us have, and may not have yet come to the conclusion that open is the most efficient, sustainable, transparent and fairest way. So I think if you're struggling to follow the amazing example of Edinburgh, of the National Forum, of the UCLs, of the other kind of champions of this, please join the discussion list anyway and share your story about why it's difficult, because those stories about why it's difficult really are equally as valid as the wonderful stuff, the data, the research, the OERs, the policy statements that we need to share as well.
Thank you, Helen, for that. I would totally agree with the suggestion that we need to share the difficulties. And I think this is something that definitely hearing more of what the difficulties are in this current time would also allow ALT to be able to try and reach the ears of those who are making the decision, who are so far away that they don't understand, to bring them up to speed with that. I think that is definitely a can-do, meeting people where they are rather than sort of expecting them to leap forward to be as wonderful as Edinburgh or what Catherine's doing. Great suggestion. Are there any other questions? Somebody else wants to come in? Oh, okay. There are no more questions. I certainly haven't spotted any. Oh, have you got any blog posts, papers, stories about what's this great approach? I think that's probably bringing people along, I think. I'm not aware of whether anybody's written about difficulties yet. But it could be a theme, it could be a call. Put a call out for papers. Lorna, please come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the comment that Leo made in the chat there, that there are a lot of people who are actually doing quite a lot of work in the open, but they don't necessarily feel part of the open education community that I think many of us here would feel part of, and they're not plugged into these networks. And I think, it is how do we reach these people? How do we involve these people? And I think now is a critical point in time when so much has changed so very quickly. People are having to adapt to very new ways of working. How do we reach out to these people and bring them along and involve them? And Maren mentioned the call has just gone out for the OER conference, and that's something I'd really like to see, is next year's OER conference actually making an effort to reach out to some of these people, to engage them with the open education community, so that they'll see it as something that they're actually already almost part of, and that you don't have to really do anything particularly different or challenging or novel to become an open education practitioner. Sometimes it can be as simple as, just sharing something, sharing your own practice, and it doesn't have, it can be as simple as a blog post.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to show the simple ways that people can engage with open education and contribute to something like the Open COVID Pledge.
Great question. Thank you, Leo. Thank you, Lorna, for that response. Anything else? Catherine?
Perfect sharing, Elizabeth, and finishing us just perfectly on time.
Okay. I just wanted to second everything, obviously, that Lorna just said. I think, that openness to, to who and how we work, who we are and how we work is part of the work. And I also just wanted to acknowledge ALT, perhaps, because one of the things, in a different way, because one of the things I've been thinking about recently is that, ALT, and particularly the Open Education Conference, the OER conference, have been leading on conversations around critical approaches to open for several years now. It's 4 years since the Politics of Open conference in London. So a lot of the issues that people may be encountering now who are new to digital and open education around surveillance and algorithms and so on are are topics that have been, explored in practice and in research and in scholarship within the open education community for several years now. So, so perhaps for those of us, again, in the open community, it's about connecting some of those dots, connecting people to those communities and those conversations, because, I see that a lot of these conversations are new to people now, where these are, mature conversations in the likes of an OER conference or an ALT conference. So, so I'm leaving the session with a lot of ideas for work to do going forward. So thank you.
Okay, and Lorna, do you want to have the last word?
Sorry, actually, I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to very briefly answer. Hiba put a question in the chat client there about, is the Open COVID Pledge for Education similar to volunteer work? And I think that is something that we always have to be cognizant of, is that there is this tension between the engaging in the open education space and all the issues that relate to digital and invisible labour, and that not everybody is able to share openly. Not everybody has the economics, security to be able to do that, or the time to be able to do that. But I think really what Pledge is trying to do is to share as much of our routine practice as possible. So it's where it's what we've done in our jobs over the last year, and how much of that can we share. So hopefully the overhead would not be as significant as actually having to sort of volunteer to do a whole other new piece of work, because I think we do have to be aware of these issues of digital labour in the open space. So that's...
Thank you. I think our time is up. If you, the other participants who are here, if you'd like to give a round of applause to our wonderful panel who've done a sterling job in introducing the topic, bringing it up to speed and responding to your questions. Thank you all very much for your time, and hopefully you will continue tomorrow to take part in some of the other sessions as well. Thank you, panel members. That was wonderful. Really appreciate it. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for chairing.